Hey y'all, how you doing? Alrighty, first peerScholar activity. The idea of this video is to give you a much clearer sense of what we would like you to do in this activity, but let me start with the more important part perhaps, which is why we're asking you to do this. So you've been reading in the textbook all about the science of psychology, and something we really embrace at U of T, where you get a bachelor's of science if you get a psychology degree, and that's because we very much embrace that empirical or experimental approach to gaining knowledge, right? We learn things by doing experiments that are meant to test hypotheses. Those hypotheses are linked to given theories. So you've heard all of that. And now we want to sort of, you've even seen some experiments talked about in textbooks, and you've seen things on the news. But this is the time when we really want to connect you with the real where the rubber hits the road when it comes to research, and that is journals. So as you probably know, but let me just make clear this, everybody who does research at U of T, their hope is they're going to get some interesting data. And if they do, they will write that data up as a journal article and submit it to a journal and say, will you please publish my research? That article describes what they found, and should also highlight the theory and the hypothesis, although I'll come back to that because sometimes they don't do it as well as they could. But it's meant to describe the research in such a way that if somebody else wanted to redo that research, they have all the information they need. So this is sort of what makes scientific articles difficult. The idea when you're writing a scientific article is not to make it interesting and engaging. It's not like a short story or a poem or a song where you want to hook the person and get them really to enjoy it. The purpose of a science article is to be as clear as you can be and precise as you can be. So to describe what you did, but to describe it in very clear, precise ways. And so that means when you first interact with journal articles, they may not seem all that interesting. And they may seem hard to understand because part of that precise, communication ends up being jargons. So within certain disciplines, they come up with terms and they use them in certain ways that they all come to understand. And that allows them to communicate very clearly with one another. But to somebody who's new to an area, that jargon can be hard. You have to kind of get to know what that word even means when these people say it. And so your first sort of entree into journal articles, or what we call primary sources, can be very tough. It gets better the more you interact with it. And so part of the idea here is to get you on that journey, to start you with the process of interacting with journal articles, and to try to give you, some support as you do that. And the idea here is I want to think already towards the end of the course a little bit. And I also want to consider the current environment in which we live in, which is an environment in which anxiety has run rich. And you guys will learn about anxiety a little bit in the biology of psychology, the biology chapter, the neuroscience chapter of the course. And so I kind of want to bring all these things together. And so here's the idea. At the end of the course, you know that we're going to be creating these short little mental health audio clips. And we're going to create a so-called, what was it called? Journey in English that we'll then translate to other languages. So let's start that process now, but with a small bite-sized chunk. So the idea is I would like you to find a primary source article that's related to anxiety, but specifically something that could reduce anxiety, or something that somebody might use to manage anxiety, or at least to understand it better. I'm going to be very clear what I mean by that in just a moment. Let's be clear about it right now. I'm going to come on here for a second, and there's a variety of ways you can find these journal articles. But one way is through something called Google Scholar. And so, for example, let's say anxiety and sleep. When you do this, you will find a number of different articles that will relate anxiety to sleep. In some cases, it might be about having a lot of anxiety makes you sleep more poorly. But we would like a little bit more of we want to be thinking in a sort of prevention and a management perspective. We want to be thinking, what tips could we give somebody to help them manage anxiety? So we'd like to understand the relationship between anxiety and sleep, but we would love it if anybody has done anything, and you see all these things here, where they have manipulated sleep and looked at its effect on anxiety. So that we could maybe imagine a group where one group was allowed to sleep in a good way and another group wasn't, and how did that change their anxiety? And if we find out that good sleep insulates you from anxiety, for example, well, that's one of the things we might talk about in our video at the end of the class. We might give people, tell them about this, that a good night's sleep helps them, and give them some tips about how they can enhance their sleep, for example. So there's a number of things, and I don't want to give too many away, but let me give you some of them away. So we know that sleep is related to anxiety. We know that diet is related to anxiety. You could find out some things about the connection of those. We know that exercise is related to anxiety. Okay, so there. We know that laughter, throw a few more there, laughter, singing, dancing, social connections, your social network, all of these things are relevant to your anxiety level. And all of these things are, like, let's imagine exercise. All of these things are things you could maybe use. Exercise for the treatment of depression and anxiety. There you go. These are all things, and for any of these, you can click on them, by the way, and get to the journal article itself. So these are all potential things. And I just threw you out a bunch of search terms. Maybe there's others, but even with those ones, what I would like you to do is find a paper. And okay, now let's be a little more clear. We want this paper to be experimental. So we want it to include an experiment, which by now you should know what that means. But just to be clear, somebody should have manipulated some variable across at least two groups, usually a control group and an experimental group, and thereby assess the effect that variable had on some other variable. So it might be manipulating exercise and looking at the effect of that on anxiety, for example. I want you to find a paper that has an experiment in it. Now, a lot of papers, by the way, may have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 experiments in them. I just want you to worry about one, okay? So if you find a paper that has, say, 3 experiments, just maybe pick the first one and focus on it, or pick one of them and focus on that experiment. But find one that has an experiment that's related to something that might impact anxiety, okay? Once you find that paper, read it. It's going to be hard. A lot of jargon. Really fight your way through it. If you have certain words and you don't understand what they are, use your dictionary. Let's say somebody's talking about negative priming, and so you can always put a term in quotes like this, negative priming, and then maybe definition. Yeah. And you should see something, maybe even full Wikipedia thing. And now they're giving you this whole story about this phenomenon called negative priming. And so, somebody might very quickly talk about, this phenomenon is very similar to negative priming. And you're like, well, what the heck does that mean? You may have to do a bit of this. Okay, that's what negative priming is, and etc. So expect to do a little bit of fighting with the paper, but try your best to understand it as deeply as you can, to understand that experiment. Then what we want you to do in your auditory 3-minute thing, I'm going to come back to that in a moment, is the following. It's sort of 2 things, but the first thing has a number of levels. All right. So the first thing is to summarize the experiment that you just read. Okay. And by summarize, we mean in your own words. Do not plagiarize. Not worth it. Okay. Try your best. It's better to say it in your own words and get it wrong than to plagiarize and get it right. Okay, we'd rather have it in your own words. That's sort of the challenge here, is trying to really understand what they're saying. And so read that experiment and summarize it. put it in your own words. Here's what they did. Now, specifically, what do we want in that summary? We want you to highlight the theory that's being tested. We want you to highlight the specific hypothesis that flows from that theory and that connects the theory to the experiments, right? Then we want you to highlight what was the independent variable, the variable that was manipulated. What was the dependent variable? And finally, of course, what was the result? And, well, not finally, one more. Does the result fit with the prediction or not? Does it confirm the prediction or not? So there's sort of 6 things from the summary, right? Let's go through those again quick. What's the relevant theory? The hypothesis, independent variable, dependent variable, result, and did it confirm the theory or not? Okay, those are the things you want to hit in your summary. So let me just talk about that first quickly. Not every researcher lays out their theory and hypothesis as clearly as you would like, as clearly as new people to science would like. They sometimes just sort of talk about their theory as though everybody kind of knows what they're talking about a little bit, or they talk about it sort of vaguely. And so you might have to do a little bit of effort. They won't say, the theory we're testing is called X. Well, they might not say. They might say this. But the theory we're testing is called X, and it holds the following blah, 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 blah. They may just talk about what they think is true, and that's kind of the theory that they're testing, right? And similarly with the hypothesis, you would think people would say very clearly, and this is the hypothesis we derived from the theory. Boom. But often they don't. Often you have to kind of figure out what the hypothesis is by looking at what they're testing. And so all this to say, don't expect them just to lay out the bits and you go, oh, there's the theory, oh, there's the hypothesis. You're going to have to read it. You're going to have to understand what those things are. Theory versus hypothesis versus independent variable versus dependent variable. And as you read it, you should be able to figure out what those things are. And then you put those together in your summary. That's the first part of what you do. The second part is what we're going to call the next step. Okay, and here we want you to think a little like a scientist. We want to get you a little bit into that scientific mindset. And so the idea is, okay, you just read about how exercise can affect anxiety, let's say. After reading that experiment, if you were a researcher, what would you like to do next? What's the next thing you think people should study that's related to that point? So I want you to start making predictions yourself. I want you to start thinking into the future about something. And so as much as you can, make this a theoretically driven thing. So many students say, oh, what I would do next is I would do the same thing with twice as many people. Okay, why? Is there a reason you want to do it with twice as many people? Or, this group had a lot of males in it, so I would want to test a group that was primarily female. Okay, but is there a reason for that? So, when you propose what you would like to do next, you would like to suggest that it could add to the story somehow. And the story is based on the theory, right? And so if you can, and this will be a challenge, but try to take it that next step of something you think would be an interesting next study to do. And we're not expecting, wow, this is a PhD in the making, but we want to push you to start thinking this way and challenge you to do that, okay? So let me just sort of backtrack really quickly. The idea here is for you to find an article related to something that might help people manage anxiety. And I gave out a bunch of ideas there. And make sure it has an experiment in it. And then once you find that paper, and you can start doing that now, and you should. Don't leave this to the last minute. It's a hard thing to do at the last minute. So you should start reading that paper. You should start to really try to understand that experiment and map the parts of it onto theory, hypothesis, independent variable, etc. And then once you feel like you have a good feel for it, then what you might want to do is write out what you're imagining. In fact, we are going to ask you to submit a written transcript as well as the audio. I'm going to talk about the audio in just a second. So the written transcript might be the place to start. Start out by writing your summary and writing out what you would do next. And you can start those anytime, right? Get going anytime. Now, we do want to play with treble, and we're thinking mostly about the project at the end for that. But let's get some experience now. So what I'm going to do, and I haven't done it yet, I'm going to reach out to the treble guy and I'm going to have a little video interview with him. We'll talk a little bit about treble itself, just to give you a sense of, real world stuff that's going on out there, and how this particular dude is trying to make a living, so to speak, in an entrepreneurial way. So give you a little bit of that story, but mostly we're going to get down to brass tacks about, okay, how do you use treble? How do you use it to create a short 3-minute audio thing? And so the instructions will be there. So I will very shortly have that video. I will include it in peerScholar with this video to give you specific instructions on how to do the audio file. I will send it out as an announcement. So I don't have that right now. But for now, you can start looking at the journal articles, finding things you like, and starting to think through and even writing out your summary. And again, eventually you will submit both the audio cast and a little transcript that goes with it of what you say. I think I've hit everything. Yeah. Okay, so that's the idea. Obviously, there may be questions about this, and we will keep track of the questions on the Quirkus page, right where the peerScholar thing is. There's an FAQ underneath. So if you ask me questions, I'll probably add your question and my answer to the FAQ. And yeah, have fun going into the world of journals, learning what it's like to publish a paper somewhere. And, one day, hopefully, one of those papers will have your name on it. That's the sort of end goal we're potentially going towards. And so let's start by giving you a sense of what these journal articles are all about. Okay, cool. Have fun. Good luck. See you later.